The thing nobody tells you about the last warning is how quiet it sounds. Not loud, not dramatic, not like thunder rolling across the stars. Just quiet, calm, the kind of voice you'd hear from someone who has already decided, someone who isn't angry anymore, someone who has moved past anger into something else entirely, something colder, something final. I was standing in the observation bay of the Cashin Reach, a mid-tier diplomatic relay station sitting at the edge of the Tharvan Expanse, when Admiral Mara Solano delivered that warning to the Galactic Conclave. I was part of her communications crew. My job was to monitor signal fidelity, manage encryption handshakes, make sure nothing got dropped or garbled during the transmission. I did my job. Every single word came through perfectly. And I remember thinking, while the alien council members on the other side of that feed shuffled their feathers and clicked their mandibles, and exchanged those looks that species always exchange when they think humans aren't paying attention, I remember thinking, they don't believe her. That was the mistake. Not the first one, not even the 100th, but it was the last one they'd ever get to make. Let me go back a little, because this story doesn't start in that observation bay. It starts 3 weeks earlier on a planet called Vesa Prime. Vesa Prime was a contested resupply world, nothing glamorous about it. It sat along a trade corridor that 6 different species used regularly, and it had one of the largest neutral zone fuel depots in that entire sector. It wasn't beautiful. The atmosphere was a permanent shade of amber from the sulfur content. The gravity was about 0.8 standard, and the settlement that humans called Dusthaven, because of course we did, was a collection of prefabricated modules, landing pads, and fuel exchange platforms that looked like someone had shaken a box of screws over a desert and just left them where they fell. About 4,000 humans lived and worked on Vesa Prime, maintenance crews, fuel technicians, a small team of UED, United Earth Directorate diplomatic staff, a medical unit, 2 squads of garrison soldiers whose official designation was Peacekeeping Support Contingent 7, but who everyone just called the Sevens. The Sevens weren't there to fight. They were there to exist, to be a visible human presence, to remind the half-dozen species that moved through Vesa Prime's fueling lanes that humans were stakeholders in this corridor too. That's what they were supposed to be. And then the Veth arrived. The Veth are, I'm going to describe them as carefully as I can, because if you've never dealt with the Veth, the descriptions you've heard probably undersell how genuinely unsettling they are to be around. They're tall, about 2.5 meters on average. Their bodies are covered in overlapping plates, not exactly scales, not exactly armor, something in between in shades of deep blue and violet that shift depending on their emotional state. Their faces are flat, almost disc-like, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern. 2 primary eyes in the center, 2 peripheral ones near the sides of the skull. They see in spectrums humans can't. What makes the Veth genuinely unsettling isn't the appearance. It's the way they carry themselves. Every single Veth moves like they're already certain of the outcome, like the conversation you're having with them has already happened in their heads and they're just waiting for you to catch up. It's not arrogance exactly. It's something more fundamental. It's the body language of a species that has never genuinely lost a war. In 800 years of galactic expansion, the Veth had never lost a war. They wanted everyone to know that. The Veth fleet that arrived at Vesa Prime wasn't there for fuel. They weren't passing through. A Veth diplomatic envoy named Subprelate Alvin, ranking somewhere around what we'd call a vice-admiral in terms of actual authority, brought 12 warships into the Vesa Prime system and issued what he called a Corridor Rights Reclassification Notice. What that meant in plain language was, we're claiming this route. Your guests here now. Act accordingly. The UED diplomatic staff immediately filed a formal objection through the Galactic Conclave dispute process. Standard procedure. The process had about a 14-week response window. Everyone knew that. It was designed that way. The conclave was better at paperwork than it was at speed. While the paperwork moved through the system at the speed of interstellar bureaucracy, Subprelate Auvin decided to speed things along in a more practical direction. His soldiers came down to Dusthaven. Not to attack, not initially, to occupy. There's a difference in the law. Occupation of a contested zone during an active reclassification notice was technically permitted under Conclave Interim Provision 7.4, as long as no force was used against civilian personnel. Auvin's soldiers were careful about that. They were careful in the way that people are careful when they know exactly how far they can push before the law catches them. They moved through Dusthaven. They commandeered the main operations center. They rerouted communications through their own relay system. They set up checkpoints between the residential modules and the fuel depot. They didn't fire a single shot. They didn't need to. When you put armed soldiers between people and their food supply and their communications, and you do it with 12 warships sitting overhead, you don't need to fire a shot to make a point. The Sevens, Peacekeeping Support Contingent 7, were ordered to stand down and maintain a non-confrontational posture pending diplomatic resolution. That order came from the UED command structure. Standard escalation protocol. Don't give the Veth a pretext for elevating this from an occupation to an armed conflict. The Sevens followed the order. For 11 days. On the 12th day, a Veth soldier at Checkpoint 3, the one between Block D Residential and the medical unit, stopped a woman named Dr. Una Hargrove. Dr. Hargrove was Dusthaven's chief medical officer. She was 43 years old. She'd been on Vesa Prime for 6 years. She had a daughter back on Earth she called every week. She was on her way to the medical unit because 3 children in Block D had developed a reaction to a particulate in the air filtration system and needed treatment. The Veth soldier stopped her and told her she needed to present a movement authorization form. She explained she was a medical officer responding to a pediatric emergency. He told her again, movement authorization form. She didn't have one. Nobody in Dusthaven had one. They hadn't existed 72 hours ago when the checkpoint system went in. The soldier denied her passage. Corporal Daniel Reyes of the Sevens was standing 40 meters away, watching this happen. He'd been watching the checkpoint since his shift started at 600. He'd watched the Veth set up their table, run their equipment checks, organize their little operation with the kind of efficiency you learn from 800 years of doing things like this. He watched the soldier stop Dr. Hargrove. He heard her explain about the children. He heard the soldier repeat the regulation. He waited because his orders said non-confrontational posture. He waited for about 30 seconds. And then he started walking toward the checkpoint. I want to be clear about something. What Corporal Daniel Reyes did next was not in the regulations. It was not approved. It was not sanctioned by his chain of command, which was actively working through the proper channels, which was doing everything the right way. What he did was walk up to the checkpoint, put himself between Dr. Hargrove and the Veth soldier, look the soldier in his 4 eyes, and say, with complete calm, "She's going through." The soldier was about 30 centimeters taller than Reyes and wearing articulated combat plating. Reyes was in a standard-issue garrison uniform with no weapons drawn. The soldier said something in Veth that the translator rendered as a command to step aside or face consequences under interim provision enforcement protocols. Reyes said, "She's going through." 3 more Veth soldiers moved toward the checkpoint. The rest of the Sevens, all 16 of them currently in Dusthaven, started moving, not running, walking, converging on Checkpoint 3 with the kind of measured, deliberate pace that isn't panic and isn't aggression, just purpose. Subprelate Auvin was notified. He arrived at Checkpoint 3 within 4 minutes. He found 16 human garrison soldiers standing in a loose formation around the checkpoint. Dr. Hargrove had already been escorted through by 2 of the 7's medics, who had simply walked her to the medical unit, while Reyes held the attention of the original soldier. The children got their treatment. Alvin looked at the humans standing there in their light garrison gear, in their human-made fabric uniforms, and he said through his translator, "I've read the transcript. These were his exact words. You have made a significant error." Sergeant First Class Priya Akafer, the ranking member of the 7's present, replied, "We got a doctor to her patients. If that's an error, we'll live with it." Alvin left. That afternoon, he filed a formal incident report with the Galactic Conclave. The next morning, 2 more Veth warships entered the Vesa Prime system. By the time the incident reached Admiral Mara Solano's desk on the Cashin Reach, it had already been through 3 levels of UED diplomatic review. The consensus was careful, measured, deeply concerned about escalation, and recommended a formal apology to Subprelate Alvin and a reprimand for Corporal Reyes. Solano read the recommendation. She set it aside. Then she pulled up the raw footage from Checkpoint 3. She watched a Veth soldier block a doctor from reaching sick children. She watched a corporal walk up to that soldier with no weapons drawn and just say, "She's going through." She watched it twice. Then she opened a channel to the Galactic Conclave and requested an emergency session. She got it in 6 hours. The Conclave was curious, if nothing else. Humanity rarely requested emergency sessions. Humanity was usually the one being called into emergency sessions. The Conclave chamber, which I was patching through on a secondary relay, was a virtual environment the Conclave used for interspecies sessions. Everyone appeared as a life-size representation, rendered through their own respective communication technology. For some species, that meant a precise holographic avatar. For humans, it meant a good camera and a decent processor. Solano appeared in her dress uniform, dark blue with silver accents. Her hair was pulled back. She was 51 years old and had spent 30 of those years in various forms of deep space service. She had a face that had learned how to be patient. There were representatives from 14 species present. The Veth sent Subprelate Alvin himself. He appeared in full ceremonial plating, violet shifts moving slowly across his shoulder guards. He was, I later learned, in a state their physiology registers as something close to amusement. He thought this was going to be a formal apology session. Solano waited for the chamber to settle. Then she said, "Representatives of the Galactic Conclave, I am here to address the situation on Vesa Prime. I am also here to deliver a formal position statement from the United Earth Directorate regarding the broader pattern of behavior this situation represents." Alvin's amusement, according to the color analysis we ran afterward, shifted slightly. Less amusement, more attention. Over the past 9 years, Solano continued, there have been 47 recorded incidents in which human civilian or support personnel were subjected to what Conclave documentation classifies as administrative friction within contested or reclassified zones. In each of these incidents, UED followed prescribed de-escalation protocols. In each of these incidents, the responsible parties faced procedural review that resulted in an average sanction of 0.3% of trade licensing fees. In each of these incidents, the behavior continued. She paused. Not for effect. I know what pausing for effect looks like. This was the pause of someone checking their own thoughts, making sure they meant what they were about to say. UED's position effective today is as follows. Human personnel, civilian, medical, diplomatic, or military, are not to be obstructed, restricted, or subjected to administrative processes that do not equally apply to all parties in a given zone, regardless of any reclassification proceedings that may be active. This is not a negotiable position. It is not the opening of a dialogue. It is notice. A Kelvari representative. The Kelvari are tall, thin, covered in iridescent down feathers, and tend toward what I describe as institutional nervousness. Asked what UED intended to do if this notice was not honored. Solano looked at the camera. I think, she said, that the species in this chamber have a reasonable understanding of what humanity does when it decides something is necessary. She wasn't threatening. She was just stating a fact. Humans, in the short time they'd been part of the galactic community, had demonstrated something the older species found genuinely difficult to categorize. It wasn't aggression exactly. It wasn't recklessness. It was something that looked, from the outside, like a complete and total absence of the self-preservation instinct that every other species treated as the fundamental principle of foreign policy. Humans didn't stop doing things because doing those things might hurt them. They stopped doing things because doing those things was wrong. And when they started doing something, they didn't stop until it was done. The conclave had read enough history to find this deeply alarming. The session ended without resolution. The conclave needed time to deliberate. Standard procedure, 14 weeks. Solano left the session. She went to her quarters. I found out later from her aide, who told me years after, that she sat in her quarters for about an hour before she called home. Her son was 11. His name was Marco. She talked to him about his school project, which was a model of the Kepler Space Telescope. She helped him figure out the angle on one of the solar panel arrays. Then she went back to work. On Vesa Prime, the occupation continued, but something had shifted. The Veth soldiers at the checkpoints were a little less certain in their body language. Word travels in the conclave. People talk. The session had been recorded, logged, and distributed to every diplomatic node in the system within 48 hours. Everyone had watched Mara Solano deliver that statement. Everyone had noticed what she didn't say. She hadn't threatened. She hadn't made promises. She just said, "This is our position. You know what we do when we decide something is necessary." And the thing was, everyone in that chamber did know. Let me tell you about human warfare, from the perspective of someone who has spent her career watching other species react to it. When most species go to war, they go to war the way they do everything else, strategically. They calculate advantages. They probe for weaknesses. They advance where they can and retreat where they must. They are, above all, rational. War for most species is a tool. A dangerous, costly tool, but a tool. You use it when the calculation says the outcome is worth the cost, and you stop using it when the calculation changes. Humanity went to war the same way humanity built things, explored things, and survived things throughout its entire planetary history. Completely. When humans decided a war was necessary, they didn't prosecute it as a calculation. They prosecuted it as a project. The entire species bent toward the problem. Industry, science, agriculture, culture. Every single resource got reorganized around the central objective. You didn't win a war against humanity by making the cost too high. You couldn't. Humans had already decided the cost was acceptable before they even started. The only way to win against humanity was to make them decide the war wasn't necessary in the first place. And once humanity decided it was necessary, that window had closed. The species in the conclave, the Veth, the Kelvari, the Drossian Collective, the Pale Fleet, the Morth Assembly, all of them, they understood this in an academic sense. They'd reviewed humanity's history. They'd read the analyses. They understood it the way you understand a weather pattern from a textbook. What they hadn't understood yet was what it felt like to be on the other side of it. They were about to understand. 3 days after the conclave session, Subprelate Alvin escalated. I don't know if it was a calculated decision, or if his pride made the choice before his reason could stop it. The Veth, for all their 800 years of unbroken victories, had a relationship with pride that their diplomatic training never fully managed to contain. He expanded the checkpoint system, not just the main corridor, all of them, every pathway between residential modules, every access route to the fuel depot, every pathway to the communication arrays. He also issued a new directive. Non-Veth personnel found outside designated movement corridors would be escorted to a central holding facility for documentation review. A holding facility for documentation review. On a human-staffed installation, Sergeant Akefer contacted Admiral Solano at 3:40 station time. The message was short. She laid out what was happening. She stated that the Sevens were currently non-confrontational. She stated that several civilian personnel had already been stopped trying to reach their workstations. She stated that fuel depot operations were effectively suspended because the human technicians couldn't get through the checkpoints. Then she said, "Ma'am, requesting updated orders." Solano's response came back in 11 minutes. "I was on shift when it came through. I ran the encryption handshake, verified the authentication chain, and opened the channel." Solano's voice was very calm. She said, "Sergeant Akefer, I am transmitting a revised rules of engagement package now. Please review Section 3 specifically. The short version is this. Vesa Prime is a United Earth installation. Human personnel have full freedom of movement within that installation. Any attempt to restrict that movement is to be treated as hostile action. You are authorized to respond accordingly. Do you understand?" Akefer said, "Yes, ma'am." Solano said, "Take care of your people." What happened in the next 6 hours on Vesa Prime was efficient, professional, and by every account I've read, very controlled. The Sevens moved. Not in a panic, not with shouting. They moved in coordinated teams through every checkpoint simultaneously. When Veth soldiers attempted to enforce the movement restrictions, the Sevens used minimum necessary force to remove them from the access points. Non-lethal first. Always non-lethal first. The Sevens had trained on this. How do you deal with an enemy you are not currently authorized to kill, but who is also significantly larger and better armored than you? Very quickly, very precisely, very thoroughly. By 800, every checkpoint in Dusthaven had been cleared. Veth soldiers were confined to a designated zone near Landing Pad 7, the area that had essentially become Oven's forward base. Not detained, not harmed, just moved. Every human civilian had free movement restored. Dr. Hargrove went to work. The fuel depot came back online. Subprelate Oven sent an emergency transmission to the Galactic Conclave. He described it as an unprovoked military assault on Veth peacekeeping forces by human garrison troops. He was not technically wrong about the facts. He was extremely wrong about the context. The Conclave scrambled an emergency session. This is the session I was in the room for. The observation bay of the Cashin Reach had a direct feed into the Conclave's virtual chamber. Not because we were participants. The UED diplomatic staff was officially present. Solano was the primary speaker. But because Solano had requested her communications team be monitoring all signal traffic during the session. She wanted to know if anyone tried to send a message they didn't want her to see. We monitored, and I watched the session unfold on my secondary screen while I ran the signal protocols on my primary one. Oven spoke first. He was in full ceremonial regalia. His color was deep, violent violet, which in Veth physiology maps to something close to controlled fury. He laid out the incident in careful, precise terms. The illegal assault, the removal of lawful peacekeeping personnel, the violation of Interim Provision 7.4, the need for immediate conclave sanction against the UED. He was composed, he was credible, he presented documentation. Then Solano spoke. She didn't match his formality. She wasn't in her ceremonial uniform this time. She was in her working blues. It wasn't a mistake. She'd chosen that deliberately. She said, 14 days ago, a Veth soldier blocked a human doctor from reaching 3 sick children. I filed an incident report. The conclave's response was to schedule a review for the standard 14-week window. She held up a single sheet of printed paper. These are the medical records of the children Dr. Hargrove was treating. They recovered. They are fine. That is not the point. The point is that the conclave's process, as designed, would have allowed that obstruction to continue for 14 weeks while the documentation moved through the system. She set the paper down. 9 days ago, I addressed this chamber and told you that UED's position had changed. I told you that human personnel would have freedom of movement, full stop, regardless of reclassification proceedings. I told you this was notice, not a negotiation. The Kelvari representative made a sound like wind through dry grass, which their translator rendered as, the UED action was still a violation of Interim Provision 7.4. Solano said, Interim Provision 7.4 will need to be revised. The Drossian representative, the Drossians are aquatic. They attend conclave sessions via pressurized environmental suits that always remind me of old diving bells, bubbled something that translated as, the conclave's provisions are not subject to unilateral revision by member species. Solano said, no, they're subject to revision by conclave vote. I'm formally requesting that vote. On what grounds? On the grounds that Interim Provision 7.4 allows military occupation of civilian installations as long as no lethal force is used. On the grounds that this provision has been used 47 times in 9 years, 39 of those times by the Veth. On the grounds that what the Veth did on Vesa Prime, blockading a medical officer from reaching sick children, was not peacekeeping. It was coercion. And I think if you vote honestly, every species in this chamber who has watched this happen to their people will agree with me. Silence. The conclave chamber was very, very quiet. Because here's the thing, she wasn't wrong. The Kelvari had been on the receiving end of Interim Provision 7.4 twice, so had the Morth. So had a small independent trader species called the Selm, who didn't even have a seat at this particular session, but whose incident record Solano had clearly done her homework on. Ovin's color shifted. The violent violet moved toward something darker, more uncertain. He said, the UED is attempting to use a manufactured incident to rewrite conclave law to serve human strategic interests. Solano looked at him. She said, Sub-Prelate, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer honestly if you can. He said nothing, which she took as permission. In those 47 incidents, she said, how many of them did you personally authorize? Silence. We have the records, she said. You don't need to answer. I'm asking because I want you to understand something. She paused again. That real pause, the checking yourself pause. The Veth have spent 800 years learning how much they can push, and every other species in this chamber has spent varying amounts of time learning how much they're willing to be pushed. My people are still figuring that out. Another pause. I think we've figured it out. The vote happened. Not the 14-week timeline. An emergency vote right there in the session. Interim Provision 7.4 was suspended pending full review by a margin of 9-4. The 4 votes against were the Veth and 3 species with significant Veth trade relationships. Subprelate Ovin's 12, now 14, warships above Vesa Prime were formally designated as occupying a zone covered by the suspended provision. Under conclave emergency suspension rules, that meant they had 72 hours to withdraw. Ovin did not withdraw. I want to be honest about this next part. I don't know exactly what Admiral Solano expected to happen. Maybe she expected the 72 hours to play out and the conclave to convene a second emergency session and extend the deadline and the whole thing to drag on in the way things always dragged on. What I know is that she spent those 72 hours very busy. She was in communication with UAD Command. She was reviewing something. I caught fragments through my monitoring duties, nothing I was meant to see, but when you're running signal traffic for 36 hours straight you notice things. She was reviewing deployment rosters. Not the Cash-and-Reach's rosters. Fleet rosters. On the 48th hour, Oven made his second mistake. He sent 2 Veth soldiers into the Dusthaven medical unit. Not combat soldiers, administrative soldiers. They were looking for Dr. Hargrove. Specifically, they wanted to formally serve her with a Veth legal citation, a document accusing her of operating within a restricted zone without authorization on the day Corporal Reyes had walked her through Checkpoint 3. A legal citation for a doctor who had gone to treat children. The 7 stopped them at the medical unit door. Oven escalated again, sent 10 soldiers this time. The 7s held the door. Oven sent a message to Solano directly. Withdraw your garrison troops or face the consequences of obstructing lawful Veth administrative process. Solano's response was 3 words. 72 hours. Meaning you have 24 hours left on your withdrawal window. Use them. Oven didn't use them. At hour 72, his warships were still above Vesa Prime. At hour 72 and 1 minute, Solano opened a channel to the Galactic Conclave and stated formally for the record, the Veth fleet above Vesa Prime has failed to comply with the Conclave's emergency suspension ruling. UED is now treating this as a hostile military presence and will respond accordingly. The Kelvari representative asked what that meant. Solano said, it means you should probably move your trade ships out of the Tharvan Expanse corridor for the next 72 hours. Here is what humanity had been doing for the past 48 hours while the Conclave was deliberating, and Oven was sending soldiers to serve legal citations to doctors. The UED 7th Response Fleet, 16 ships, not diplomatic relay vessels, not peacekeeping contingents, warships, had been in a silent transit burn toward Vesa Prime from their patrol position 2 systems away. Nobody had announced this. Nobody had filed paperwork about it. Nobody had issued warnings to the Conclave or sent messages to Oven. They had just been moving, quietly, the way you move when you've already decided something and you see no reason to negotiate about it. Admiral Solon hadn't waited for the 72-hour deadline to deploy them. She deployed them the moment Oven refused to withdraw. What happened next? I'll try to be clear about this, because there's been a lot of mythology built up around it in the years since, and the mythology obscures the truth in ways that aren't useful. The 7th Response Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light transit on the edge of the Vesa Prime system at 6:12 station time on day 5. 16 ships. Oven had 14. He also had, and this was significant, and this was something Solano had factored in, 800 years of battlefield experience on his side. The Veth were genuinely skilled warfighters. Their tactical AI systems were among the best in the Conclave. Their weapons technology was, by objective third-party assessment, roughly equivalent to humanity's. But here is the thing that none of those assessments ever quite captured. The assessments measured capability. They didn't measure commitment. Oven hailed the incoming fleet. Standard Veth protocol. He identified himself, stated his authority under the occupation procedures, and demanded the human ship stand down. The response that came back was not from Solano. It was from the captain of the lead ship of the 7th Response Fleet, a man named Captain Eli Dawes. I've spoken to Captain Dawes since. He's not a dramatic person. He's quiet, methodical, has a habit of tapping his thumb against his knuckle when he's thinking. What he said to Subprelate Alvin was, "Subprelate, this is the UED 7th Response Fleet. We're here to remove your ships from above a human installation. You can leave on your own or we can help you leave. There's no third option." Alvin said his 14 warships were more than sufficient to defend against 16 human vessels, and that Captain Dawes was making a catastrophic miscalculation. Dawes said, "Maybe, but we're going to find out." I was monitoring the communications from the Cassian Reach. I had feeds from every relay node in the system. I won't describe the engagement in technical detail, partly because I was watching it through signal telemetry and sensor data rather than directly, and partly because the technical detail isn't actually the point. The point is what it felt like. And what it felt like was a wall. The 7th Response Fleet moved toward the Veth warships, and they did not slow down, and they did not maneuver for advantage, and they did not do any of the sophisticated tactical ballet that Alvin's people were trained and experienced and very good at. They just went straight at them. Alvin's fleet was configured for standard engagement protocols, probing maneuvers, flank assessment. This is how you fight when you have 800 years of victories behind you, because 800 years of victories teaches you the value of measured approaches. You know what measured approaches are vulnerable to? Something that isn't measuring. The 7th Response Fleet took hits, real hits. 3 ships took significant structural damage in the first 8 minutes. A 4th had to pull back with a drive system failure. A 5th took a hit to her primary weapons array and spent the rest of the engagement as a mobile electronic warfare platform instead. They did not stop. They did not slow down. They kept going. I think about what Subprelate Alvin was feeling in those 20 minutes. I've tried to reconstruct it from the communication transcripts and the sensor logs and the accounts I've pieced together from various sources over the years. I think he expected the human fleet to respond to casualties the way every other species responded to casualties: pull back, reassess, negotiate from a new position. I think he expected that when 4 of his warships were disabled in the opening exchange, because the 7th Response Fleet hit hard even while taking hits, the humans would pause and see the exchange rate and decide the math wasn't favorable. I think he did not understand, even at that point, that the humans weren't doing math. At minute 16, Alvin received a message from one of his Conclave contacts. I don't know the exact contents, but I know roughly what it said, because Alvin's response was immediate and clear. His color, which our sensor analysis captured, shifted to something I'm told maps to a state called recognition, which in Veth physiology is not quite fear and not quite awe. It's the state you enter when you realize you have been wrong about something fundamental. Because what his contact was telling him was this: UED had not sent 16 ships. 16 ships were the first wave. Behind them, still in transit, were 40 more. Admiral Solano had not said any of this in the conclave. She had not mentioned fleet strength. She had not made threats. She had just done the thing she said humanity would do when it decided something was necessary. She had organized completely, thoroughly, without announcement, without warning, without negotiation. She had decided this was necessary the moment Dr. Hargrove was stopped at a checkpoint. Everything after that had just been process. Alvin withdrew. Not dramatically. No speeches. His 14 ships, 7 of them fully operational, 4 partially damaged, 3 pulled back from direct engagement, made the jump to FTL and left the Vesa Prime system. He filed a conclave complaint about it later. Of course he did. There were hearings. There was documentation. There was a lengthy process that I had to maintain signal traffic for over several months. In the end, The Conclave Revised Interim Provision 7.4. The new version was quite clear. Military occupation of civilian installations required prior conclave authorization, not just a reclassification notice. The threshold was significantly higher. The automatic approval process was gone. Subprelate Auven was recalled to the Veth Central Authority. I'm told he retained his rank. The Veth don't publicly punish people for strategic miscalculations. They do, however, reassign them. He was moved to an administrative role overseeing interior logistics. He never commanded a fleet again. Corporal Daniel Reyes was formally reprimanded for breaking protocol at Checkpoint 3. The reprimand was the most technically correct and practically meaningless document I have ever seen in a military file. The reprimand was filed. The record was kept. Nobody ever mentioned it to him in any professional context again. I know this because I later served on the same station as Reyes for about 18 months, 3 years after Vesa Prime. He'd been promoted twice by then. He was a staff sergeant. He was exactly who you'd expect. Quiet, competent, the kind of person who does things because they're right and then doesn't particularly want to talk about it. I asked him once, and I want to be clear, this was off-duty. I wasn't a journalist. We were just two people eating terrible station food in the commissary. I asked him, "What were you thinking when you walked up to that checkpoint?" He thought about it for a while. He said, "I wasn't thinking much. She needed to get through. He was in the way, seemed pretty simple." I said, "You knew they could have hurt you." He said, "Yeah." I waited to see if he was going to say more. He didn't. He went back to his food. Dr. Una Hargrove is still practicing medicine. She left Vesa Prime a year after the incident. She'd been there long enough, she told me, and she had a daughter she wanted to see more often. She runs a clinic now, not deep space, a regular clinic. She treats regular patients. I found her profile once, years later. She hadn't written anything public about the incident. She doesn't appear to have given any interviews. If you searched her name, you'd find her medical credentials and her clinic and nothing else. The children she treated that day fully recovered. Admiral Mara Solano continued in her role for another 11 years after Vesa Prime. She was involved in 3 more situations that involved UED response actions, though none of them escalated to the same degree. She retired at 62. She gave one interview to a UED internal publication on the occasion of her retirement. The interviewer asked her what she'd learned from Vesa Prime. She said, "I learned that warnings only mean something if people believe you'll follow through. And I learned that the way you get people to believe that is not by making bigger threats. It's by already being in motion before anyone asks you to be." The interviewer asked if she'd been concerned about the Veth's military capability. She said, "Of course." "But you deployed the fleet anyway." "Yes." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I had a doctor being blocked from reaching sick children, and I had 16 soldiers standing in front of a medical unit door because they wouldn't move. And somewhere between those two things, the calculation got pretty simple." Part 2. The Galaxy didn't take the lesson the way Solano hoped. I want to be honest about that. Because the story that gets told, the clean version, the version that ends with the revised conclave provision, and everyone going home and order being restored, that version leaves out the next 18 months. It leaves out what happened in the Seln trade belt. It leaves out the Morth Assembly's decision regarding the Outer Passage. It leaves out Admiral Tomas Vrecker, who is the person this part of the story is really about. The Seln are a small species, not militarily significant. They're traders mostly. They've been traders for as long as anyone has records of them. Their ships are recognizable, angular, bright copper coloring in the solar reactive hull coating, and they operate along a specific cluster of routes in what the Conclave calls the mid-expanse. The Seln were not members of the Galactic Conclave. They were what the Conclave classified as observer status, meaning they followed Conclave regulations in exchange for certain trade protections, but didn't have voting rights. For about 60 years, this arrangement worked reasonably well. Then the Morth Assembly decided they wanted the mid-expanse roots. The Morth are harder to describe than the Veth. They're not physically intimidating, they're actually rather small, about human height, with pale gray skin and large dark eyes and a slightly hunched posture that makes them look, at first glance, like they might be ill. They're not. Their biology just tends toward conserving energy, which means they rarely make expansive gestures or stand at their full height unless they need to. What makes the Morth significant is their longevity and their memory. The average Morth lives for about 400 years. They do not forget things. Not in the colloquial sense, not in any sense. Their recall is essentially perfect. Every negotiation they've ever been in, every treaty they've ever signed, every provision they've ever read, it's all there, perfectly retained. This makes them very good at finding the specific clause in a specific provision that allows them to do the specific thing they want to do. The Morth Assembly wanted the mid-expanse roots because the mid-expanse sat adjacent to a system they'd been developing for 30 years, and which was about to become extremely valuable once their deep-bore extraction operations completed. The roots would let them move product efficiently. The Seln were in the way. The Morth found a clause. Conclave Trade Charter Appendix 14, Section 6, Subsection C. Observer status entities operating within established member species trade zones may be subject to route priority adjustments as determined by assembly of 3 or more member species holding combined majority trade volume in the relevant zone. The Morth went to 2 other species, made some agreements that I suspect involved promises they fully intended to keep until they didn't need to, and got the assembly of 3. They filed the route priority adjustment. The Seln received the filing. They appealed. The appeal process was 14 weeks. During the 14-week appeal process, the Morth sent enforcement vessels to the mid-expanse routes to begin administrative verification of Seln vessel documentation. Administrative verification in this context meant, we stop your ships, we inspect them, we find compliance issues, we impound them pending resolution. They didn't impound every Seln ship, just enough to make the routes economically non-viable. The Seln had no military force worth mentioning. They filed an emergency appeal to the Conclave. The Conclave was processing it. 14 weeks. I was 3 months into a new posting by this point. The UED Liaison Office on Conclave Station Varath. Varath was the Conclave's primary administrative hub. Think of it as the bureaucratic center of everything. Thousands of species representatives, diplomatic staff, trade delegations, and administrative workers, all in one enormous orbital structure that looked like someone had stacked 8 different cities on top of each other and put them in space. I was working for the UED diplomatic delegation there, signal monitoring as always. I had a small desk in a large office and a decent view of Varath's main ring if I pressed my face against the right corridor window. My direct supervisor was a diplomat named Counselor Adiz Nwankwo, who was one of those people who made you feel slightly disorganized simply by existing near her. She was meticulous, principled, and had a specific expression for when the Conclave was being slow that I came to think of as the Varath face. A very controlled kind of tired. She had the Varath face when she called me into her office 3 weeks into the Seln situation. She said, I need you to look at something. She showed me the Morth Assembly's filing. She said, this is technically legal. I said, it's destroying the Seln trade network. She said, yes, that's the goal, and it's technically legal. I said, what's UED's position? She said, "That's what I need to figure out." The Seln had something that I want to explain carefully, because it matters for what came next. They had a relationship with humans. Not a formal relationship, not a treaty, nothing on paper. But Seln traders had been operating alongside human freight operators in the mid-expanse for about 12 years. They'd overlapping routes. They'd done joint logistics planning. They'd shared navigational data. The way small operators do when they're in the same space and they need to cooperate to compete with the bigger players. Seln vessels and human freighters had spent 12 years sharing data, sharing rest stops, occasionally helping each other when something went wrong out in the deep corridors where help was slow to arrive. It wasn't much, in the grand scheme of galactic diplomacy. But it was something. When the Morth started impounding Seln ships, the human freight operators noticed. And they noticed not from diplomatic dispatches. They noticed because they got messages from Seln captains they knew, personal messages. "Our ships are being stopped. Our routes are closing. We don't know what to do." Those messages made their way, through various paths, to Counselor Nwankwo's desk. And then to Admiral Tomas Vrecker's desk. Tomas Vrecker was the UED fleet commander for the Conclave region. His official posting was Commander, UED Conclave Adjacent Forces, which was a title that made it sound like he sat at a desk all day reviewing paperwork, which was not accurate. Vrecker was 54, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and a scar along his jawline from a decompression incident early in his career. He had 3 decorations that were publicly acknowledged, and, per the rumors that always surround senior fleet commanders, several more that weren't. He had a reputation for 2 things. The first was patience. He was, by all accounts, genuinely patient. He would wait. He would watch. He would gather information long after other commanders would have moved. The second was decisiveness. When Vrecker decided to move, the decision was complete. There was no half measure, no probe, no toe in the water. He'd watched the Vesa Prime situation from his posting. He'd watched Solano. He had clearly learned from her. When Counselor Nwankwo forwarded him the Seln situation with a query about UED options, his response came back in 4 hours. It was 2 lines. "The Morth are going to want something from us eventually. When they come asking, let's make sure they understand there's a price for what they did to the Seln. In the meantime, I'd like to know the location of every Morth enforcement vessel in the mid-expanse." The Conclave appeal process ran. 7 weeks in, halfway through the 14-week window, the Morth Assembly had impounded 63 Seln vessels, roughly 40% of the entire Seln commercial fleet. The Seln economy was not collapsing, but it was under significant strain. The Seln Merchant Council, which was about the most governing body the Seln had, filed a supplemental distress notice with the Conclave. The Conclave acknowledged receipt. Processing continued. Counselor Nwankwo requested a meeting with the Morth Assembly's Conclave representative, a Morth diplomat named Pralark Seven, old even by Morth standards, something like 260 years old, which meant she had participated in negotiations that predated several of the current Conclave's member species, agreed to the meeting as a courtesy. I attended as Nwankwo's communications support. The meeting was in one of Verath's secondary conference rooms, small space, 4 chairs, a circular table with a built-in translation relay. Seven attended with 1 aide. Nwankwo brought me. Seven was, in person, profoundly still, the way very old people sometimes are. She moved deliberately, and she did not waste motion or words. Nwankwo opened politely, as she always did. She said, "Pralark Seven, thank you for making time. I wanted to discuss the route priority adjustment proceedings in the mid-expanse." Seven said, "The proceedings are within Conclave regulations." Nwankwo said, "They are. I wanted to understand the Assembly's intentions regarding the impounded Seln vessels." Seven said, "The impoundments are for documentation compliance review. They'll be released when their documentation is verified." Nwankwo asked how long that was expected to take. Seven said, "These things take time." There was a pause. Nwankwo had her own version of patience, I'd learned. She didn't fill silences. Eventually she said, "The Seln have a significant relationship with human freight operators in the mid-expanse. Disruption to their network creates operational complications for our civilian logistics as well." Seven said, "We regret any inconvenience to UED logistics." Her tone did not suggest she regretted anything. Nwankwo said, "Is there a path toward expediting the documentation review?" Seven said, "Documentation review follows its own process. I wouldn't want to suggest shortcuts in compliance procedures." It was the most controlled form of dismissal I've ever witnessed. Complete, polite, impenetrable. We left the meeting. In the corridor outside, Nwankwo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send Vrecker the vessel locations." Admiral Tomas Vrecker did not deploy a fleet. I want to be clear about this because the Vesa Prime model, the idea that humanity's answer to everything was military force, misses something important. Solano had used force on Vesa Prime because the situation required it, and because the Veth had left no other option. Vrecker understood that the situation with the Morth was different in a specific way. The Morth were not making a military move. They were making a legal move. A patient, precise, well-researched legal move. The kind that only a species with 400 years of lifespan and perfect memory can make, because it requires that kind of longevity to fully master the game. You don't fight that with warships. You fight that with someone who can play the same game. And humans, here is something the Conclave consistently underestimated. Humans had been playing long games for a very long time. Vrecker forwarded the Seln situation to a team within UED that most people in the diplomatic corps didn't interact with directly. The Treaty and Provision Review Division. Their official function was reviewing UED treaty obligations and advising on conclave regulatory compliance. Their unofficial function was finding things. Specifically, finding the specific clause in a specific provision that allowed UED to do the specific thing it wanted to do. They were staffed almost entirely by lawyers. Seven had 260 years of perfect memory and the most comprehensive legal research apparatus the Morth Assembly maintained. She'd never gone up against 600 human lawyers with access to every piece of conclave documentation ever filed in 60 years of UED membership. It took them 11 days. What they found was Conclave Commercial Charter, Volume 3, Trade Protections and Observer Relationships, Article 22, Section 4. Member species with established operational relationships with observer status entities may invoke protected operational status on behalf of said entities in circumstances where observer status entity commercial viability is demonstrably threatened by regulatory action that was not available for review prior to its implementation. Protected operational status had been used exactly twice in conclave history. Both times were in the early years of the conclave, before the current regulatory framework fully existed. It had essentially been a dormant provision for about 40 years. What it meant, in plain language, if you had a working relationship with the Seln and you could show the Morth's filing damaged your operations, you could file for POS on the Seln's behalf, which froze all regulatory action against the Seln pending full conclave review. Not the standard 14-week review. Full conclave review, which meant conclave General Assembly, which meant every voting member, which meant the Morth needed a majority of the conclave to continue their action. And they didn't have it. They had their assembly of 3. They did not have a majority. UED filed for protected operational status on behalf of the CELN Trade Network at 900 station time on a Tuesday. I processed the filing myself. I know exactly what time it went through. By 1100, the Morth Assembly's representative had filed a challenge. By 1300, the conclave's administrative office had reviewed the challenge and confirmed that UED's filing was valid under Article 22, Section 4. The impoundments were frozen. Immediately, no vessel could be further detained pending the full conclave review. The 63 CELN ships in Morth holding were released within 48 hours. Prelark Seven requested an urgent meeting with Councillor Nwankwo. This time she didn't come with one aide, she came with 3. The meeting was not in the small, secondary conference room. She requested the main diplomatic suite. Nwankwo agreed to it. I was again in attendance as communication support. I can tell you exactly what Seven looked like when she came into that room. She was as controlled as she'd been in the previous meeting. 260 years of diplomatic composure doesn't break easily. But her eyes, Morth eyes, are very dark, very large, and they don't move the way human eyes do. Her eyes tracked Nwankwo very differently in that second meeting. There was, in that tracking, something I can only describe as reassessment. She said, "Counselor, Article 22, Section 4 has not been invoked since the early charter period." Nwankwo said, "It's a valid provision." Seven said, "It requires demonstrable operational relationship." Nwankwo opened a folder physical paper, which was a choice, and slid it across the table. 12 years of shared navigational data exchange between UED freight operators and the CELN Trade Network. Joint logistics planning documentation from the Mid-Expanse Corridor Consortium. 47 recorded instances of mutual operational assistance between UED and CELN vessels. I think demonstrable is a reasonable characterization. Seven looked at the folder. She did not pick it up. She said, "What does UED want?" Nwankwo said, "The CELN want their routes." Seven said, "The Morth Assembly has strategic interests in the Mid-Expanse." Nwankwo said, "I understand, and the CELN are willing to discuss a modified routing arrangement that accommodates those interests, as long as it's done through negotiation rather than regulatory action." Seven said, "And if the Assembly declines to negotiate?" Nwankwo said, "Then the full conclave review proceeds, and in a full conclave review, the record of how 63 CELN vessels came to be impounded will be part of the public documentation." A pause. "The Kelvari will be interested in that record," Nwankwo said. "So will the Pale Fleet. Both have had route priority adjustments filed against them in the past 15 years. Under similar circumstances." Seven's stillness in that moment was a different kind of stillness than the one she'd brought to the first meeting. It was the stillness of calculation. She said, "I will consult with the Assembly." The negotiation took 3 months. I won't detail every session. There were 26 of them. I attended most of them. They were slow, meticulous, often frustrating, occasionally fascinating. What came out of them was a modified corridor arrangement. Not the Morth's route priority claim, not the old status quo, but something new that the CELN could operate within, and that accommodated Morth extraction logistics without shutting CELN trading down. The CELN Merchant Council approved it. The Morth Assembly approved it, quietly, with the kind of controlled expression that meant they were satisfied enough and not happy about being satisfied enough. It wasn't a victory in the dramatic sense. Nobody made a speech. Nobody got a medal. 63 ships went back to work.